On April 9, 2016, Quincy, Illinois Reverend Krista Taves introduced longtime organizer, educator, and writer Chris Crass in an anti-racism seminar at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Columbia. Her introduction itself is an interesting look at anti-racism work. Please join us as we listen to Krista Taves.
Thank you. All right. I would invite one of the social justice folks from here to come light our chalice. Janice, would you come light our chalice? And I see our chalice lighting as kind of like a vow. So I'm going to, like in a wedding, I'm going to give you your line, and you'll say it back to me, and that's going to be our chalice lighting. Let us reach the place of self. The place that is not alien to truth. Let us wash over the peace and serenity. With fierce longing, for light and heart. With living strength, flowing in our veins. Bring ourselves into fearlessness. And into trust. May it be so. So I used to make a living painting houses. That is how I put myself through grad school. And I once had this client who insisted that me and my fellow painters paint her home in pure white. She wanted pure white. And we told her that there is no such thing. Every white has a tint. If you go to Lowe's and look at the paint department, you will see that there is no pure white. There's a bluish white, greenish white, brownish white, all kinds of whites, salmon white, whatever kind of white you're looking for, but there is not pure white. And she would not believe us. She ordered us to use paint without tint, believing that would get her pure white. And we told her that paint without tint is useless because tint gives the paint its strength and adhesion. Without tint, paint runs down the walls while it's drying. It peels at the slightest touch, and you can see right through it. And she would not believe us. So we made her sign away her warranty and pay us by the hour. And the paint literally slid down the walls as we put it on. We had to paint up, like backwards, to keep the paint from holding on. And after 6 coats of paint, you could still see right through it. And the touch of a fingernail did damage. And still, she did not believe us. So why am I telling you about white paint this morning? Wonder why. Okay. We have gathered to do this important work, the work of racial justice, which is the work of saving black lives and saving white souls. Because every one of us has a racial identity, the tint that gives our whole life experience meaning and shape. This tint shapes our perceptions, our emotions, our beliefs, and even our day-to-day choices. In America, it shapes our possibilities and our opportunities. It shapes how we are perceived by others. And yet, when it comes to awareness of this tint, many of us who are white, like my client, are unable or unwilling to see the tint that shapes our lives. We believe we are self-created beings. And those of you who are visible minorities, those of you who are black and brown, are most likely to see the tint in yourself and in whites because your circumstances in America force you to. In fact, your life depends on understanding the tint in white paint that many whites can't see themselves. Your life depends on it. But whites, we tend to see our experience as devoid of a racialized element. And in truth, that illusion is like paint without tint. It is very dangerous, and it is transparent if you have the eyes to see. Chris Crass calls it the death culture of white supremacy. And this death culture is built on the bodies of hundreds of years of enslaved African Americans, and during the 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, and the last 50 years of the war on drugs and mass incarceration. And this death culture is supported by millions of whites in a bubble of privileged ignorance, unaware of how their racial socialization shapes their perceptions, their opportunities, their reactions, and even their emotions. And because of that ignorance, those of you who are black or brown have every reason to fear for your lives, which can easily become like flakes of paint falling to the floor. And there is no warranty for those lives. On August 9th, 2014, Michael Brown, an unarmed black man, was shot by Darren Wilson, a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. And Michael Brown lay there for 4.5 hours, and even if the reasons given for why that happened are true, it hit a nerve. And first of all, I don't believe the reasons are true. That was a simile. But even if they were, it kind of doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because him laying there for 4.5 hours hit a nerve, and the crowd's anger was like flame touched to dry wood. Ferguson uprising had begun. And protesters gathered outside the police department nightly. They shut down intersections, interstates, and town hall meetings. And our cell phones offered live streaming and running Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook feeds with hashtags like Stay Woke, Black Lives Matter, Shut It Down. And what did we want? A special prosecutor to handle the investigation of Wilson. We wanted African American stories of police brutality to be believed. We wanted body cameras, training in implicit bias, police demilitarization, stronger limits on use of force, an end to the corrupt municipal court system, and a complete overhaul of the justice system. That's all. And we expressed these demands relentlessly. Protesters were not polite. They showed their anger. They didn't ask nicely. They used strong and foul language. They blended the revolutionary goals of Malcolm X and the nonviolent methods of Martin Luther King into a new kind of revolution. And yes, there were episodes of violence, but none were condoned by the movement. We trained ourselves in nonviolent civil disobedience. And we knew that the media and most whites would label the movement illegitimate if even a few people engaged in property damage or acts of violence. So the leaders tried to direct the anger in constructive, nonviolent ways. And even so, the establishment response was predictable. It was as if someone had dug their fingers into paint with no tint, and what was revealed was so horrific that it had to be written off as quickly as possible. So the protesters were lawless rioters, police brutality was downplayed or dismissed, racial profiling was questioned, corruption was danced around, there was condemnation of civil disobedience. And when an individual or groups of individuals resorted to violence or property damage, the entire movement was blamed. And when I think back on this time in the city that I call home, I have reflected about something that the prophet and teacher Jesus said to his disciples and those who followed him. He who has ears, let him hear. And what I heard happening in our nation as Black Lives Matter spread through city after city, into the streets and universities and city halls and police departments, was the struggle of whites to hear and see and believe that the system they trusted in was like paint without tint. Systems so many of us whites believed were, basically fair, were emerging as deeply flawed. And the cost to the communities of color has been staggering, and it is unacceptable. Just like I asked my client to trust that paint without tint is unreliable, Black activists were challenging whites to see that a system that appeared to work for them didn't work at all. the system is broken, and we need to shut it down. The Black Lives Matter movement is offering whites yet another chance. How many chances do we need? Another chance to walk out of the illusion of tintless white paint and into a place that is more painful, more heartbreaking, and infinitely more real and more authentic. And for people of color, for black and brown people who have always been aware of this tint, this is an opportunity to step away from the internalization that all this crap that happens to you is somehow your fault. That it's because, oh, you were driving too fast, you did have a taillight out, oh, you were walking along that sidewalk just in a little way that wasn't appropriate, you were crossing the street at the wrong time, you didn't have your right ID on you, you didn't have your seatbelt on, you were speaking a little bit too loud, you dared to look that cop in the eye. All the things that you've learned, all the ways that you've been taught to keep your head down and stay out of trouble, this became an opportunity to say, screw you, over and over and over again, with no apologies, with no apologies. So what the Black Lives Matter movement has offered us all is a chance to be more alive, because it is grounded in truth, and it is the truth that sets us free. And so we have had an opportunity to wake up, and now we have the chance and the responsibility to stay woke. And I think that's why we're here today, is because we want to figure out, now that the streets aren't filled with people all the time, now that the struggle has shifted from primarily the streets to the boardrooms and the meeting rooms and the halls of power, what does it mean to stay woke? How do we stay woke when it is so spirit-shattering to see those realities, to see that painful place, to see the power, the death culture of that white supremacy asserting its power over and over and over and over again. And one more police officer gets off with another murder, again and again and again and again. We are seeing the power of the system. And the temptation to retreat from that painful place and back into the bubble of comfort is always there. You know, those of us who are white, we know what white shaming is like, right? You stick your head up, you start saying what you see, and all kinds of white people are ready to shut you down over and over and over again, to shame you back into silence and complicity. So how do those of us who are white stay woke in the face of that shame and have that inner strength to keep going? How do we do that? You know, and those of us who are people of color, how do you stay woke when the system keeps on stealing your people? How do you face that fear and that reality over and over and over again, and not just get tired and go home and say, oh, can't do it. Too hard. Too hard. And I also say, you know, when I'm comparing the white and black experience, I want to hold up as a real difference in the pressure to retreat. For whites, the pressure to retreat is shame. For blacks, the pressure to retreat is physical harm and death. Okay, so very, very different. They're not equal in any way. So we are here today, I believe, as a way to resist the temptations of retreat. We are here because what has erupted in our nation, the energies that have coalesced in the last 20 months, has captured our hearts, rekindled our hope, and we want to give ourselves to the struggle. And so we're here this weekend because as Unitarian Universalists, we know that this difficult work cannot be done alone, because we are in a covenantal faith that tells us that we are bound in webs of interconnectedness and mutuality. None of us is strong enough to do this work on our own, and if we are not in right relationship. We are bound in webs of interdependence that sustain us and challenge us to grow and change and become more than we were. What are our tools? As Unitarian Universalists, our tools are community, relationship, trust, risk, compassion, and stubbornness. These are the tools that we can draw on to engage in the pursuit of justice. And what's at stake here is freedom. Freedom for us all. And that freedom is never free. And so each of us has to discern what we are willing to lose, what we are willing to put at risk for the sake of that freedom. So we're going to close our time today with a chant. It's called the Asada Chant. How many of you have heard of the Asada Chant? Okay, the Asada Chant is often used before, during, and after Black Lives Matter actions. It has become one of the rallying cries used to coalesce the energy that has been built in that action. And this chant was written by Asada Shakur. She's considered a domestic terrorist by the FBI, but by many others she is considered a freedom fighter. She was a member of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army in the 70s. She was tried and imprisoned, and then she broke out of prison and lives in exile in Cuba. And her cultural impact on the Black Lives Matter movement has been powerful, because Black Lives Matter is so often about holding up the humanity of those labeled as criminals, whose lives have become disposable. And the chant is very simple. I'm going to ask you to stand. And there's one line I want you to reflect on. One line reflects on losing our chains, and let's remember that what those chains look like for us varies very much based on the race we are perceived as. Okay, the chains are not the same. So here we go, and we'll do it the same way as we did the chalice lighting. Call response. It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and support one another.
We must love and support one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and support one another.
We must love and support one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but
All
our
right,
chains.
let it go. It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to fight for our freedom.
It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and support one another.
We must love and support one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
I would invite you to join with me in the spirit of prayer. Spirit of life that dwells in and with us, let us honor the spirit of all life in our incessant search for justice and peace. May we experience a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. May we have the will to live up to our covenant of right relationship in our congregations, our communities, our nation, and our world, that we might be the people on the side of the oppressed, the poor, and the marginalized. Give us today what we need, that we might have the will and the strength to build a new society. Forgive us our shortcomings. Do not let us fall into the temptation of believing ourselves already new people. And deliver us from the evil of forgetting that our lives are not ours alone. Amen and blessed be. You may be seated. So it is now my great pleasure to invite and introduce to you Chris Crass. I got to know Chris Crass in the year of the Ferguson Uprising because, like so many people, I found myself woefully unprepared to meet the demands of the moment. And I was looking for some way to understand what I was seeing and then find a constructive way to put myself in that struggle. And Chris Crass was one of those people. I found him on Facebook, friended him on Facebook, and he had this running commentary and this awesome blog that helped me to start to understand that what I was seeing was the death culture of white supremacy. He gave me and many of my colleagues and many Unitarian Universalists who were out there on the streets a deeper systemic understanding of what it was we were fighting against. And Chris was in an awesome place to do this because I think Chris must have been an activist in the womb. I think he's been resisting all kinds of injustices probably from the time he ushered his first cry. He has been on the forefront of many movements, and he's been part of many movements fighting for gender equality, against racism, fighting for immigrant reform and justice. But what he really is a revolutionary. And he has a way of seeing the intersectionality of all kinds of different oppressions and seeing them all working through and reinforcing one another. And then he starts looking at how you can just pick things off of that intersectionality of oppression. And how do you do that in a way that affirms your values and creates real lasting change that is truly freeing? And so I'm very excited that Chris is here, because I think for many of us that we're now in this supposed quiet lull time, this is an opportunity to build up our resources so that when the time comes to kick some ass again, that we will together have the tools we need to do that and to be the people we say we are.